Hello again, everyone. In this video, we'll look at the h3 King's Indian white early sidelines, where he doesn't play d5. The normal one that you'll see is d takes e5, as this was recommended somewhere as a safe way to play for white. I don't think it's very challenging, but there's a tiny twist on the exchange variation. I actually think it's a worse version of the exchange variation for white, so we should be very happy to face it. Like in the last variation, where white goes to the exchange, we can actually take over the initiative very easily. We'll jump right in. First of all, here, we'll just check a couple of other moves that are played very rarely, but are pretty bad ones. Bishop e3. Now, this one is probably white getting modeled up. You can play this way with the knight back on g1 and play d5 instead. That's how to play the bishop e3 line with h3. Here, we know from our classical knight bd7 line that if white has committed to h3, we're generally very happy to take on d4 because it's so difficult to defend this pawn on e4 adequately. The reason is that white can no longer really play Maroczy bind spirit with f3 because it weakens the dark squares too much, g3 and f4 in particular. Taking with the bishop is even worse here, because we already have a tactic. Unsurprisingly, when white has wasted move with h3, we have knight takes e4. Now, bishop takes g7 is an interesting try, but rook e8 defends the knight. Threatens knight takes c3 check, so forces knight takes e4 or bishop e2. Against knight takes e4, we just take on e4 check and then take the bishop. Else we'll just take the bishop immediately. We've just won a solid extra pawn. Or knight takes e4, rook e8, attacking the knight, and if it's defended with bishop d3, we'll play f5 next, and we collect that knight. And once again, we'll be a pawn up. So bishop takes is not to be advised. Knight takes is better. And now a subtle little move order twist. I think it's stronger to play knight c6. The immediate rook e8 is okay, but then white can play bishop d3, and he keeps his center together at least. I mean, this position is fully playable, but at least we don't equalize immediately, or even take the upper hand slightly immediately. So let's go knight c6. White actually has a bit of a problem here. If he goes to e2 with bishop, now let's attack the pawn. I didn't want to do it immediately because of bishop d3, but now it's quite hard to defend this pawn. f3 is just so incredibly ugly that white really doesn't want to do it. There'll be knight h5 and the knight is jumping into g3. We also have ideas of queen h4 check in some positions. The knight might end up on f4 too. That's a relatively main line of the ed4 line, back with the pawn on h2, and white having castled instead. And this is just a fantastic version. So f3 is really not wanted to be played, but bishop f3 to defend the pawn has a tactical flaw. We take. Clearly white can't take with the queen because of knight takes e4 and just go to attack on the queen. The bishop takes also allows bishop f5 with problems against the e4 pawn. Here white has to decide what he's giving up. Does he allow us just to play knight takes e4 and win a clear extra pawn? Or does he play bishop takes f6 and give up that dark square bishop and just give us fantastic long-term chances? Both are obviously very unpleasant. So bishop e2 doesn't really work. Therefore, white should play bishop d3, but now we can use the fact we play knight c6 instead of rook e8 to break immediately with d5. This tactic works because the knight on d4 is no longer defended by the queen. And so after ed5, knight takes d5, we're attacking it twice, and it's only defended once. It's important that knight takes c6 doesn't work. We can take on e3, hitting white's queen, and we end up, if not up material after the queen exchange, at least clearly better with our bishop pair on an open board. So cd5 is better. We take. Next, we'll play c5 to support this knight, but we'll just be a bit better with our good bishop. So I can try and force things with bishop takes g6 with a discovered attack on our knight. But we recapture. F takes is nice to activate our rook, and queen g5. And white now just doesn't have a good way to defend the pawn on g2 without active pieces. Therefore, his king stays exposed, and we have a very good position. So bishop e3 is certainly not ideal for white, but bishop g5 is even worse. Now we have the same tricks with ed4, knight takes, and this time simply rook e8. We're actually threatening to take on e4 despite the pin, because we'll have knight takes c3, discovered check, and also attacking white's queen. White should defend with queen c2 to cut that out, but still with knight a6 we're doing very well. We have both knight c5 putting additional pressure on the pawn on e4, and the more direct knight b4 hitting this queen away, are big threats. We can also consider playing d5 to exploit the pin along the e-file. But that is better. The natural bishop d3 allows us to cash in with knight takes e4. If it's recaptured, we can take on g5 thanks to the pin. Once again, we've won a pawn and the dark square bishop. So take on d8, we take on c3, check. Next we'll take on d1, and we end up at least a piece up here. So it's the end. So neither of those moves are very good. Now d5 is clearly the best move, but de is played from time to time as well. d5, and white tends to exchange queens here too. If white plays bishop e3, the simplest is just to play knight c6. Here white doesn't have anything better than bishop e2 when we've actually transposed to the exchange variation. Bishop g5 is worse. Here we can go back to our knight bd7 classical stuff with knight d7. The bishop is actually, it looks natural in g5, but it's nearly always just bad here in the exchange variations because our knight is destined for e6. And when it gets there, we'll gain a tempo on the bishop. For example, something like bishop e2, c6, and knight c5. We're threatening to exchange queens and pick up the pawn on e4, and queen c2, queen e7. Next, we'll go knight e6 and force this bishop to retreat. I've just gained a tempo. The queen is also not great on c2. So queen d8, rook d8. Now they normally go bishop g5, pinning. Knight d5 attacks the pawn on c7. After knight a6, we'll just come to the same thing. After bishop g5, rook d6. This is just the main line, normally seen by bishop g5 first. Once again, knight to d5 is bad. Knight to d4. We saw this position with the bishop on e2 and pawn back on h2 rather than h3, and that position was bad for white. This one is just very bad. There's no advantage having the pawn on h3. It's just a tempo down. So bishop g5. Now this is white's trick or hope. With the pawn back on h2 and bishop on e2, we were playing rook e8 here, getting out the pin. And that's the main line of the exchange variation. But here, white is trying to be crafty. That after knight d5, swap c6. This is all the main line. But white gets to go bishop c4 in one go. And so he actually has an extra h3 over the exchange variation. Now, I don't think this is the end of the world. I think the position is still equal, but it's what white is hoping for. So let's not give him what he's hoping for. Instead, let's play knight a6, a common move to defend the pawn on c7. And so prepare against the knight and jump into d5. It's not clear what white does if he's not playing knight d5, though. Take on e5 is just bad again. Rook e8 will regain the e4 pawn with the typical great position. So knight d5. Now we only have one way not to lose material, but it's a good way. Rook d6, defending the knight on f6. Next, we're ready to play c6 and kick this knight away. If white just continues exchanging, hoping that every exchange gets him closer to a draw, he's actually running a huge risk. As we discussed earlier, this structure is much better for us because we've got the d4 square and white doesn't have a corresponding outpost. And if he's exchanging off the dark square bishops and a pair of knights, white is in a lot of danger of just leaving himself with a bad bishop on f1 or e2, blocked in by his own pawns, and our knight will run rings around white's position. There's not going to be an immediate win or anything, but we can just keep pressing and pressing forever, and it's really horrible for white. So don't worry about the pieces being exchanged here. Now, knight d2 is the way to defend this pawn, if white's trying to keep pieces on for now, but c6. White can go after the bishop pair, but we're very active here. And again, we've got our typical control of the d4 square. And pull bishop back, b6, just holding on to the pawn on a7, but more importantly, not allowing c5. White wants to play c5, knight c4 to try and activate this bishop on f1 and knight on d2. So we won't allow that plan. And we can coordinate perfectly. Knight c5 is a nice move. Putting pressure on the pawn on e4, and if white takes, b takes, and we'll be ready to activate the bishop from g7 with bishop h6, putting more pressure on white's position. That pin will be horrible, so white would have to get out of it. But bishop h6, and we'll win the pawn on e4, and we'll have a good endgame. So white normally captures this way. As I mentioned, exchanging everything is something we should be very happy to see. White is a long way from a draw here. There's no way for him to continue exchanging. And there's no way to play the move c4 to c3. c4, c3, and white equalizes. But without it, it's got this chronic hole on d4. For example, castle queenside, we can simply play knight c5. It's only one check on d8. If rook d8 check, king g7, and we can just play b6, bishop b7 to complete our development. So white defends the pawn on e4 instead. a5, we can complete our development with b6 and bishop b7. Attack the pawn on e4, activate our pieces. We've just got better minor pieces and a better structure. So this middle game or end game, not quite an end game, NQE, as Glenn Flair would probably call it, is very pleasant for us. Bishop d3 is similar. We can play rook d6 with gain of tempo on that bishop. Next we'll play f6 to defend the pawn, and then we can develop our bishop with bishop e6. We've activated our pieces, and once again stand well. Probably taking the pawn is the best try, but this is quite important to compare with the main line. In the main line exchange variation, black can also play this way. Imagine the bishop's on e2 and pawn back on h2. Would be that position. But this is a key difference. There, when we play rook e6, white can play knight g4. There, we can't take the pawn on e4 because it's not check. There's a bishop on e2, and knight f6 check wins our rook. And so this is playable for white, and white is a bit better. Here, though, we just take the pawn with check. So there's no time for knight f6. And so we can just develop our pieces, and we're just a bit better with our activity. And once again, this slightly misplaced pawn on c4. So this is useful to recall if you're wondering whether you can also play this way in the mainline exchange variation, because it is a lot more exciting than rook e8, which is unfortunately the move that we're having to recommend in the pure exchange variation. Obviously, knight takes f6 can't be called exciting, but at least a bit more. The aggressive b4 fails. We've got time with c6. Now, c5 is what white would like to do, gaining a tempo on the rook. He's activating the bishop. Suddenly, he's got a promising position. He thinks our rook has to defend the bishop on f6, so it has to go to e6. Then he can either calculate bishop takes a6. I think cd is working. But knight takes f6 first. We take back. Then he'll take on a6, wrecking our structure. He's got a long-term outpost on d6. Yeah, things are going well. But there's a tactic here. Rook takes d5. And after ed, e4. We attack the knight on f3 and the rook on a1. So getting two pieces for the rook and just winning position already. White's queenside pawns are also falling. So c5 doesn't work. He can try to do it by taking on f6 first, but now his b pawn is hanging. He defends it, and now we're not going to allow c5. We snap the c pawn shut on c4 and get this bishop bad on f1. He would love to have his pawns on dark squares with a light square bishop, and we're not going to allow that. At b5, and come back. Probably white should take on e5. He's suffering here, but at least he's got more potential to activate that bishop. Whereas in the game, after bishop e2, we lost a little bit of time to defend that pawn, but time isn't relevant here. We've got such a fantastic structure. we can continue with just developing our pieces with b6 and f6 and knight e6 and bishop b7, putting pressure on the pawn in e4. The knight is ready to jump into d4 at some point, and white's position is just really miserable. His bishop on e2 plays no role at all. So b4 is premature. Castle queenside is also possible, but here king g7 is probably the best. We're ready to kick this knight away. Probably we'll prepare it with bishop e6 and rook back and c6. So it's useful that we can recapture on f6 with the king. Once again, b4 is bad. It's not quite as clear cut this time. The reason that this position, we don't have e4 attacking both the rook and the knight on f3, but we take on b4, forking the d5 and a2 pawns. Now white should take on c6, but after e4 or knight says a2 check, winning more material, we're doing very well. White's king is very exposed, and all our pieces are joining the attack. White's queenside pawns are dropping. d6 is very tempting. It looks like a very strong pawn on d6. It's supported, but we can chip away quickly with b6, and actually that pawn will drop. After we take on a2, we've got 2 pawns for the exchange, and we're ready just to play b6 and win this pawn on d6. There's no way of keeping further control. The bishop's of the wrong color again to defend it. One other plan here, we'll have 3 pawns, but one very direct plan is just to go a5, a4, a3, knight b4, check a2. As our bishops are controlling both the a2 and a1 queening squares, that plan is extremely difficult to stop. The move that white was trying to get this line to work is rook c1. We've seen tactically why b4 and c5 doesn't work, but white needs to get in c5 or else he's just left with this lousy bishop on f1 and with the pawn blocking it. Whereas if he can play c5, the bishop joins the game and he can hope for something. But here, the discovery of b6 kind of killed this line, and it's no longer tried at grandmaster level. We keep control of the c5 square, and we're getting ready to slowly push this knight back. It's all about keeping that bishop on f1 blocked out of the game. Now c5 is playable anyway, but it's no longer ambitious. We can take, if you're feeling really ambitious and want a double-edged fight, rook takes d5 is worth investigating here too. We get a pawn for the exchange, but similar ideas of pushing with e4 and activating our bishops. After knight takes c5, take. We've got a fun little sequence here to exchange pieces with rook c6, leaving our rook hanging. After knight takes a8, knight d3 check, forks king and rook. Now, if white takes this, he actually ends up the exchange down after we take on c1 and then take on h1. So he has to try king d2 and go for the pin anyway with rook takes c1. And the position looks like white's in trouble here because this knight is trapped and it's an unfortunate pin. King takes d3, bishop a6 check. But white needs to find rook g1. We also have knight takes f2 as an idea, attacking that rook. But yeah, rook g1 is the only move. After bishop b7, we get pieces exchanged. And this was agreed drawn in a correspondence game. But I see no harm in continuing here. I'm sure Magnus would play this position on against anyone. We've got the bishop pair after all. We can put pressure on white. No harm in trying. So b4 is a bit more ambitious. White is preparing c5 and doesn't think that the inclusion of b6 and b4 should change very much. But now we can be ambitious with c6. If you want to be super safe, bishop d8 is also perfectly fine. But I like the position out to c6. Now, Wang Yue, the very strong and very solid Chinese grandmaster, played knight takes f6, rook takes an a3. But after c5, the thematic move, keeping this bishop trapped out of the game, the pawn stuck on c4, b5, knight c7. Even such a strong player as Wang Yue was unable to hold this position as white against Ivan Saric. It's just so bad with this light square bishop. To point out, it was 2690 at the time. It's And if a 2690 can't hold this position, then white suddenly has a lot of trouble. And you shouldn't worry about your lower rated opponent playing this way to try and force a draw. c5 is more positionally correct because white is desperate to get this bishop on f1 involved. But now we have a strong sacrifice again with rook takes d5. And this time e4 immediately, activating our bishop on f6. The knight doesn't have so many squares to go to. And the sensible one is d2. And now we take on d5. So the cost of the exchange for a pawn, so it's only a pawn. We've got a very strong dark square bishop and a big center. And white has some problems, both completing its development and on the queen side. Defending this pawn on b4 is not so straightforward. White can play a3, but now king g7 just keeps everything tidy. We'll see in a moment. We want to play bc5, but it's useful to first start with king g7 so that we don't need to worry about a subsequent rook c6. For example, after b takes c5 here, bishop takes a6, bishop takes a6, rook takes c5, white is threatening rook c6, forking our bishops. So we want this position with a king already on g7. So we don't need to worry about that threat. It's not so easy to find a good move here for white either. We've got ideas of bishop b2, winning the pawn on a3 if we want, but the main move will just be to take on c5 next. Now white has tried bishop b5, but we'll take, activating the b file for our rook. Bishop c6 and b5 was tried to keep the structure, but we just play knight c7, attack this rook. Now, if the rook goes back to c2 or c1, we happily grab on a3 with a good position with 2 pawns to the exchange and all the trumps. If it goes to c3, we can just kick it away again with d4 and the pawns continue. The a3 and b5 pawns are destined just to drop off the board here. White's in a lot of trouble. cb is another try. After a takes b6, white again has to navigate the complications very accurately. The best is bishop b5 developing, but we still have very good long-term compensation after we simply develop our pieces. Next, we're ready to get the knight, that's a bit misplaced at the moment on a6, back into the game with knight c7, which will open up the rook to take on a3. We still have this mammoth center and 2 very strong bishops on e5 and e6, giving us great compensation. Instead, rook c6 going for some sort of pressure backfires. We can sack our piece with the point of rook a1 check. King e2 is the only way to escape the check, but we check again. We may only have 3 pieces left, but they coordinate perfectly. And white is playing without the rook on h1. King e3, check again. The knight drops on d2. There's no way of holding on to it. So on king d4, take, and now the bishop is also dropping on f1. Bishop takes a6 is necessary, therefore, and we'll take the rook, and we'll beat the exchange up and in what should be a winning endgame. You see there are a lot of problems here for white. Bishop e2 is perhaps the most sensible move to try and just complete development, but again, we'll take on c5. Now, this is what I meant at the start. If white now plays bishop takes a6, we've got the same position, but with an extra king g7, which is very useful because we don't need to worry about rook c6 forking the bishops. So we can just defend the pawn on d5. And now we just have this fantastic bishop pair. White's got to figure out exactly what he's doing with his king, as he can't castle, and therefore he can't get the rook on h1 involved. So his extra exchange for pawn isn't very relevant if the rook can't actually get involved in the game. We'll probably play our bishops into d3 and d4 when we completely dominate. White's pieces are just stuck. So b5 is more dynamic to try and take the pawn back with the rook if we drop the knight back, but now we can continue attacking c4. Let's make it a whole rook, but in return we have some beautiful central pawns. b8, c3, we continue. The knight doesn't have many squares to go to. It has to go backwards or to b3. If it goes to b3, we'll still push forward with d4, next d3. The pawn on c3 is just such a monster here because white can't challenge it, and it blocks out that rook. So try knight b1. Now white is hoping for d3, knight takes c3, and he gives back a piece to at least find some activity for his remaining pieces. But we'll just play rook b8 and keep white locked up. We may only have 2 pawns for the rook, but white has 0 activity. The knight's stuck on b1. Probably have to give itself for a pawn. And the 80 pawns are dropping. There's no way that white can hold on to them. White, yeah, we'll have to give the knight at some point on c3, or else we'll just push in the center once we've supported the c3 pawn. And then there'll be the exchange for pawn, and the a pawns are dropping, so we're likely to actually end up material here. So I think we're doing extremely well in the same game. Now, sacrificing everything like this isn't necessary, but it seems a lot of fun and also sound. And it is clearly not the way that white wants to play if he's chosen any of these exchange variations. This is the last one of them. We've seen the pure exchange, the delayed exchange, the last-in exchange, and this one. But of them, probably the delayed exchange was the most boring. Well, unfortunately, if white knows his stuff there, he can make a draw. But in the others, we can keep a fight going. And certainly it's not a position that we should be worried about a lower-rated person playing against us. We can make a lot of fight. Thanks a lot for watching. See you again soon. Cheers.